Welcome. Really good to see you.
I tend to always do my meetings with world leaders best I can alone. You can just build a better relationship with them in private, and that's, what Volodymyr and I did.
Я хотів мати партнерів серед лідерів держав в тому, що вони з нами будуть до кінця, що ми не будемо на самоті.
We talked about the idea that what Russia's doing is illegal, unprovoked aggression, that what we were confronting was an awful evil, and we will need to show the Russians that we are here, not just this month, next month, this winter, but for years to come.
Is your objective defeating Russia? I mean, good luck to anybody who wants to defeat a major nuclear power on a battlefield.
On the 24th of February 2022, Vladimir Putin launched an invasion that shook the world.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей, то ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
This is the story of the year that followed, told by the presidents and prime ministers who lived through it.
The world has changed. There's a Europe before the 24th of February, and there's not the Europe after.
Я сказав, я нікуди не збираюсь. Для чого нас обирали? Ось для чого. Для цього дня.
In this episode, the impact of the war is felt across the globe.
I said that there's a war in Europe is surprising to you? It's not a surprise to me.
And as Putin tries to build his own alliances, Western support for Ukraine starts to fray.
I said, look, I'm not Amazon, right? We will do everything we can to support you, but ultimately you need to communicate beyond just here's a shopping list.
Back in April 2022, 6 weeks after Putin's invasion, the city of Mariupol was at the heart of his battle to control Ukraine.
Ничего не осталось. И все, крыши нету, ничего нету.
Russian forces were closing in on the city's huge steelworks. Putin called in his defense minister.
Владимир Владимирович, остатки формирования националистов укрылись в промышленной зоне завода «Азовсталь». Не нужно лезть в эти катакомбы и ползать там под землей по этим промышленным объектам. Заблокируйте эту промышленную зону так, чтобы муха не пролетела.
The whole city was besieged, and hundreds were trapped in the steelworks without food and water, including women and children. The UN was under pressure to act.
The United Nations didn't have a great reputation in Kyiv. I think that Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership had many complaints about our relative inactivity. We had a need to improve our standing. So I went to see the Secretary General in his office, and I said, look, it's not unusual that in conflicts of this sort that we look for humanitarian ceasefires.
We felt that it was necessary to do something, as we couldn't stop the war. I detected two letters, one to President Putin and one to President Zelensky. One day, probably afterwards, I received message saying President Putin will receive you Tuesday at 5 o'clock.
Надеюсь все-таки, что это приведет нас к какому-то позитивному результату.
Both President Putin and I, because of the camera, said what is the, I would say, official position of the Russian Federation and UN. And then we had the chance to have first a conversation.
Да, действительно, мы слышим, что там есть гражданские люди. Но тогда военнослужащие украинской армии обязаны их выпустить Или они тогда действуют как террористы во многих странах мира, прикрываясь гражданским населением.
I said, look, the UN is ready to mobilize all its capacity to make sure that we can extract the people from Azovstal to the areas that are under the control of the Ukrainian authorities. President Putin promised to think about it.
Guterres then raised another humanitarian issue, one that would affect not only the warring parties, but the whole world. Putin's navy was blocking Ukraine's grain exports through the Black Sea.
The analysis that we had was really scary. Ukraine and Russia were 30% of the market of wheat. We needed Ukraine and Russia, food and fertilizers, to come to the markets because it was the only way to prevent hunger and famine being much wider spread.
Antonio Guterres was very concerned about the food situation in the world. He proposed to strike a deal on the grain exports from Russia and Ukraine.
Guterres had a bold pitch, promising to work with the West to make it easier for Russia to export its own grain.
I said, I think that there might be a win-win solution if you would allow the Ukrainian exports to take place. We as UN would work with the US, with the EU, with UK to make sure that what is said, that the sanctions do not apply to food and fertilizers, is applied in practical terms. And I have to say his reaction was positive. I'm ready to discuss it.
Guterres had opened a door with Putin at a time when the West was trying to freeze him out. At the UN, Ukraine's allies had called a vote to throw Russia off the Human Rights Council, following evidence of a massacre in Bucha.
Russia's actions are beyond the pale. Russia is not only committing human rights violations, it is shaking the underpinnings of international peace and security.
Our position was very clear. It was like crystal clear. By expelling a country from a UN body, you do not resolve the problem. The job of a diplomat is to talk to an opponent, to talk to even to an enemy. You are not needed to talk to a friend.
We thought there was something really disingenuous about this campaign. Our European friends like a sort of politics of outrage. They sound so radical, but they're not brave enough to look forward to changing the structures of global power and privilege.
The Russian bullying machine here in New York goes into overdrive. Talking to my counterparts, they told me that Russia was threatening to withdraw visas from workers who were working in Russia. They were threatening to withdraw humanitarian assistance. In the face of this incredible pressure from Russia, one of my counterparts said to me, "We think like you, but we don't vote like you."
The real pressure usually comes from the West. So one of the great diplomatic tests is how to be close to our friends. The Americans are our friends, the British, but at the same time not beholden to them.
We shall now begin the voting process.
The vote passed, and Russia was thrown off the Human Rights Council. But Western ambassadors were surprised to get less support than they'd hoped for. 58 countries abstained, and 24 voted against, including, crucially, China. Just before the invasion, Putin and the Chinese president had declared a partnership with no limits. Some Western leaders hoped Xi Jinping could be persuaded to back them instead.
I say to Xi Jinping, look, do you really want to be shackled to this bandit? Do you really want this global pariah to be your punk, your proxy in the European theatre? Because it's not going to go well for him. He's going to lose. So I tried to make that point.
China, of course, is not convinced by Boris Johnson's argument, which it does represent a typical Western view. But that's a hubris, that's an arrogant argument.
Talking to Xi Jinping about anything like this, you know, I don't think they have the concept of the dead bat. Well, they're primitive dead bats, as we've discovered, but he dead batted everything that I said. With more dead bats in a Wuhan cave, I would say.
Boris Johnson is ignorant about evolution of China-Russian relationships. Russians sell whatever things to China China needs. Energy goods, of course, but also advanced weapon systems. Then Russians need Chinese manufactured goods, so it's a perfect compatible trading pattern between China and Russia.
Putin could count on his trade with China, so had little need for a grain deal.
I couldn't see any reason why the war would stop to let these ships go through. I couldn't see immediately the incentive for the Russian Federation to allow this to happen. Good in principle, good for humanitarians, good for the global south. Was it going to happen?
With the threat of famine still looming, it was urgent to turn up the pressure on the Russian president. In Geneva, David Harlan's organization was working with the UN to find a solution.
It was extremely hard to get something that made the deal attractive enough for Putin to want to say yes. So we tried to mobilize governments in China and in the Middle East, in Africa, to weigh in with Putin.
President Macky Sall, chair of the African Union, went to see Putin at his retreat on the Black Sea.
Je me suis rendu à Sochi au nom de l'Afrique. C'est mon devoir et le devoir des Africains de sensibiliser le président Poutine sur ce fait. C'est qu'il fallait tout faire pour aider à libérer les céréales d'Ukraine. Et que les gens souhaitent que la Russie ne crée pas de difficultés pour cette exportation.
A lot of Westerners were not very happy with the visit. They said, what the heck? He gets there and is all chummy with Putin. But, that's what he should have done.
Malgré d'énormes pressions, la majorité des pays africains quand même ont évité de condamner la Russie dans cette situation.
He was there to make one point. He can say, I love you. He can say, Russia is a great anti-colonial power. He can say whatever he wants. But he has to say, Vladimir, I want you to let the grain ships go. And he did.
Africa had spoken, but Putin was not yet convinced, and only one country had the clout to persuade him. China had invested billions in projects across Africa, and a major food crisis would threaten their success. In July, China called publicly for the Russians to support the grain deal.
Once the Chinese spoke, Russia got the message and the deal was done.
The signing ceremony took place in Istanbul, the center of shipping in the Black Sea.
It was a deep sense of relief, a sense that, something was possible, and that in the middle of that terrible tragedy, there was a beacon of hope.
That was Friday. Saturday morning, I was planning to fly back to New York, a free man, when the news came in that the Russians had bombed Odessa. Odessa is full of granaries and ships waiting to take grain. So an attack like that on Odessa was, frankly, provocative.
It was a moment in which we just stayed calm. We needed to understand that we didn't stop the war, that this was an agreement within a war.
Millions of tons of grain would soon be leaving Ukrainian ports. But on the front lines, the fighting continued unabated. Zelensky was pressing his allies for weapons that would help drive the Russians back.
У нас була дуже складна ситуація. Треба отримати новітню зброю і побудувати стосунки особисті з лідерами держав, як впливових, щодо зміцнення технологій і зброї.
We didn't have secure comms in the same way that you might want to. So me and my defense counterpart had code names for different weapon systems.
It was his idea, his invention. We called different types of weaponry like different types of whiskey.
I would say, look, I'm going to send you some Glenfiddich, which would be the N-Laws. And if we did anything that was like the Harpoon, the anti-ship, which was for the maritime, that would be Isla whiskey.
And something else was Glenmorangie, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not product placement, it's a real story.
In June, the British Defence Minister headed to Kyiv.
Ukraine was at full tilt of asking, lots of asks. But it was really important to make sure that Ukraine understood that with the ask goes assurances. So I went to talk to the Ukrainians about, the next step and that how to handle the West.
You're doing amazing. We do together. Yeah, well, no, you, Mr. President, and your people.
When we met with Ben Wallace, we discussed that we need more long-range capacity. We call it more strong whiskey during our conversation.
Yeah.
I went for a meeting with their minister and their general staff. The meeting was 45 minutes, and 40 minutes in, I hadn't really even spoken, and I just said, we're going to stop this. And I said, look, I'm not Amazon, right? We will do everything we can to support you, but ultimately, if you want to unlock more in the West, you need to communicate beyond just here's a shopping list. The United States lawmakers on the Hill will look for assurances. They will want to know that the donations that they have done are being put to good use and making a success.
The US Congress had already signed off on over $54 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine.
Nice to see you.
Jim Risch was the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
I wanted to go there. I wanted to see it personally. We talked about specific weapons that they wanted, ones that they were at that point weren't getting. Zelensky said, look, you don't have to fight this war. We will. But you got to give us help to do it. I went to the train station we were leaving, and this parade of ambulances came in. And they turned around and backed up right up against the train tracks there. And so I asked someone, I said, well, what's going on here? And they said, well, this happens every evening about this time. These are the wounded coming in and the dead coming in from the front lines. And as this train pulled in, the first few cars actually had operating rooms. I mean, you could see them operating on these people. And all of a sudden, this became very, very real. When I got back, I said to my friends here, the National Security Council and of the State Department, they need more weapons. They need weapons quicker. And yes, you've been doing some, but you need to do more. I said, folks, you don't win a war without escalating. If the enemy shoots a bullet at you, you shoot back too. Otherwise, you're going to lose.
Six months into the war, Zelensky's lobbying was paying off. Ukraine's first major counteroffensive was fueled by some of the West's most powerful weapon systems.
We introduced HIMARS, which gives the Ukrainians the ability to reach deeper. The Russians began to make choices in terms of the disposition of their forces, and they began to thin the lines around Kharkiv. The Ukrainians took advantage of that. They experienced enormous success.
Here really was surprised, as so quickly the wave of Ukrainian units moved in Kharkiv direction. Next morning, I met Lloyd Austin, and we showed them the differences on the map. They were really excited.
Putin was in Uzbekistan for a meeting of Eurasian leaders.
Добрый вечер. Киевские власти же объявили о том, что они начали и проводят активную контрнаступательную операцию. Ну, посмотрим, как она будет результат, чем она закончится.
The Russian president was meant to be amongst friends, not least Xi Jinping. But with Russian troops fast losing territory, the world watched to see how far their no-limits partnership would stretch.
Militarily, Russians' performance is a big surprise. We thought the Russians would do brilliantly, very quickly, ending that war and settle it, and there is no problem. But it looked increasingly like the Russians are bogged down there.
Concerns. That word concerns really struck me. That's what someone says when in the private conversation they've had a whole load of criticism. That's the diplomatic word for criticism, concerns.
China, like Russia itself, are concerned that the conflict may go into a phase which is lethal. This is not just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but the conflict between Russia and the Western world.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. What's the latest on Ukraine? Lots of work to do keeping everyone together.
That week, world leaders gathered in New York for the annual UN General Assembly.
The mood was sober and beginning to focus more and more on the impact of this war on very fragile countries. So there's a desire for there to be some sort of process of winding down.
Nous appelons à la désescalade et pour une solution négociée afin d'éviter le risque catastrophique d'un conflit potentiellement mondial.
Lots of countries were saying, we just want it to stop and make it stop and make it stop now. And that's quite a difficult conversation to respond to.
It was important to make sure people weren't going off trying to negotiate with Russia. The argument I would make is that we shouldn't be giving away Ukrainian territory on their behalf. Russia has become a rogue state. And the idea that you should then treat them as some kind of legitimate authority you can negotiate with is wrong.
Amongst the assembled leaders, there was a very conspicuous absentee. From Moscow, Putin still managed to seize the agenda.
В своей агрессивной антироссийской политике Запад перешел всякую грань. И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
It was very scary for many countries. It made the rest of us who were observing understand that we were dealing with an extremely dangerous scenario.
It wasn't just nuclear threats. Putin also announced he'd be calling up 300,000 Russian reservists.
It was very sad because this clearly showed that this conflict would not stop anytime soon. I mean, it's not in my job description to discuss the actions of the president of the Russian Federation, but it was clear to me that this was a sign of the continuation of this operation.
It fell to Putin's foreign minister to defend his president.
Спасибо, уважаемый госпожа председатель, ваше превосходительство, коллеги.
Sergei Lavrov just ran through this complete fantasy justification of all the traditional excuses about how it was Russia that was under threat and how they were the injured party in this.
Национал-радикальные силы, откровенные руссофобы и неонацисты, пришли тогда к власти в результате вооруженного переворота при прямой поддержке западных стран.
We were all watching what Foreign Minister Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, was doing. You could see as he began to collect his papers that he certainly wasn't paying attention.
So one of my officials, one of my team, slipped me a note, as they sometimes do, and it said, it looks as if he's about to leave. If he does, call him out. He has left the chamber. I'm not surprised. I don't think Mr. Lavrov wants to hear the collective condemnation of this council.
Russian forces still controlled nearly 20% of Ukraine, even after Zelensky's counteroffensive. In an attempt to annex this territory, Putin staged referendums in 4 Ukrainian regions and claimed victory.
Раз, два, три! Ура! Ура! Ура!
А в Москві сьогодні відбувся якийсь там черговий, чесно кажучи, фарс. Щось там відзначали, щось там скандували, співали на площі. Нелюди. Нелюди.
Мы стали сильнее, потому что мы вместе. За нами правда, а в правде сила, а значит победа. Победа будет за нами!
Just a week later, the bridge Putin had opened in 2018, connecting Crimea to Russia, was hit by a devastating explosion.
Like everyone, we saw that explosion happen on social media, and I think it was another reminder not to underestimate Ukrainians. But it's just important to ask ourselves, is there a tipping point where Putin gets really nuclear in discussion, but also what events actually make a difference on the battlefield? The morale boost stuff is really important in war, but actually could elicit the wrong response.
Within 24 hours, Russia responded with its biggest missile attack since the invasion. Across Ukraine, hundreds of thousands were left without power and water.
Того мосту ж нічого не залежить. Послухайте, немає мосту, не пересувайтесь по мосту. Але коли у вас в зимовий період немає електрики, коли у вас в зимовий період немає води, коли у вас немає опалення, це ж мова вже йде про людей. Про дітей, про літніх людей.
Zelensky needed his allies more than ever. But in America, where the midterm elections were approaching, the mood was shifting.
Now we have a war between Russia and Ukraine with potentially hundreds of thousands of people dying. We must demand immediate negotiation of a peaceful end to the war in Ukraine.
There should be no blank check on anything.
Under Republicans, not another penny will go to Ukraine.
There was a lot of question in Ukraine at that time about how the midterms were going to affect the U.S. posture towards Ukraine, whether we were going to continue the strong bipartisan support that we had.
Just days before the midterms, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan arrived in Kyiv.
Jake Sullivan's message was to reassure the Ukrainian government that United States support was going to continue.
There will be no wavering, no flagging, no flinching in our support as we go forward because we recognize the acute need for air defense at this critical moment.
Along with the words of support came a tough message.
President Zelensky had been quite clear publicly that he personally had no intention of sitting down and negotiating with President Putin, which was certainly understandable given everything that he was facing. At the same time, we were spending a lot of diplomatic energy trying to lobby the countries of the global south to try and rally international backing for Ukraine. The conversation that Jake had with President Zelensky and his team was the need for Ukraine to start thinking about what a just peace would look like and what they would want to see at the end of the war.
Ніяких компромісів з суверенітетом, територіальною цілісністю і незалежністю. І робимо все, щоб повернути наші території.
With a Republican victory in Congress imminent, Biden's ability to keep funding Zelensky's war effort was in doubt.
Forget the vote. What's your new reality going to be like in Washington?
More difficult.
Just at that moment, the war was threatening to become even more dangerous.
I was on holiday in Anglesey. I got this phone call saying, Defense Minister Shoigu wants to speak to you. Luckily, in the modern world of mobile telephones, I think I'd texted my French counterpart, and he'd said he'd just had a call. So I started to work out that he was doing a ring round. I went to a military base. We had a translator there.
The Russian defense minister was phoning to warn that Ukraine planned to use a deadly device containing radioactive material.
He believed he was in receipt of intelligence that showed Ukraine were about to use a dirty bomb. Whether he genuinely believed it because he had some duff intelligence, or whether he believed it because it suited their narrative and this was part of a false flag campaign, you're never sure. We knew it wasn't true, so but we take it seriously, and if Shoigu wants to ring me, I'll always take his phone call.
Russian talk of a dirty bomb only added to growing nervousness about how far Putin was ready to go. In front of foreign policy experts, Putin was reminded he once said Russians would go to heaven after nuclear war.
Спасибо большое. Вы сказали, что мы все в рай попадем. Мы не торопимся же, правда? Вот вы задумались, это уже настораживает как-то.
А я специально задумался, чтобы вы насторожились.
In search of someone who could rein Putin in, the German Chancellor flew to Beijing.
Auch da, China hatte noch ein strenges Corona-Regime. Wir sind für einen Tagesausflug nach Peking gereist, also morgens gelandet. Es gab ein 90-minütiges Gespräch mit dem chinesischen Staatspräsidenten.
Sehr froh, dass ich hier sein kann und wir miteinander sprechen können. Und erinnere mich.
EU leaders are visiting China. The number one priority for them is to convince China to condemn Russian behavior. President Xi does not believe that this war is only caused by Russia. NATO has been pursuing enlargement and many different policies provoke Russia.
Insofern ist es gut, dass wir einen ganz intensiven Austausch hier haben werden über alle Fragen, die wir miteinander besprechen wollen und können, auch was unsere bilateralen Beziehungen.
Und der Bundeskanzler sagte, Drohungen, klammheimlichen und weniger klammheimlichen Drohungen, auch mit einer nuklearen Eskalation in diesem Konflikt. Und insoweit war es für den Bundeskanzler auch wichtig, die chinesische Seite an diese Verantwortung, die sie hat, zu erinnern.
Mr. Xi told Chancellor Scholz there is no possibility that Chinese will be sympathetic with the Russian use of nuclear weapons in any sense, except for retaliation. So Scholz is very happy.
Während wir noch im Flugzeug waren, auf dem Rückflug, hat der chinesische Staatspräsident eine Pressemitteilung veröffentlichen lassen, in dem er genau diesen Punkt, dass es einen solchen Einsatz von Nuklearwaffen nicht geben dürfe. Was insoweit ein wichtiger Moment war.
The American president wanted to make sure Putin had got the message. he dispatched his spy chief on a sensitive mission.
The president sent me to meet with Sergei Narishkin, the head of their foreign intelligence service. You can't afford to underestimate the potential for that kind of escalation. We met at Turkish intelligence headquarters just outside Ankara. What I made clear to him was the catastrophic consequences which would unfold for Russia should, the Russian leadership ever decide to use a nuclear weapon.
Narishkin agreed to underline the strength of the warning to Putin. But before the meeting ended, there was something else he wanted to raise.
The Russians were fishing a little bit to see if we, the United States, would be prepared to be the main interlocutor in negotiations. So I did my best to disabuse Narishkin of the notion that somehow we were going to substitute for the Ukrainians in negotiation. I did at one point ask him, so what do you think the basis for negotiations would be? When he said something to the effect of, we get to keep everything we're sitting on, everything we've illegally seized, and then we'll talk about the rest. And I said, how do you expect President Zelensky or any Ukrainian leader to engage on that basis?
As Burns left Ankara, world leaders were arriving for the G20 summit in Bali. Putin was threatening to withdraw from the grain deal, adding to the pressure on world food prices, while energy costs continued to soar.
On était très inquiets de la réunion du G20, parce qu'on redoutait que cette réunion du G20 soit l'occasion pour le Kremlin d'utiliser le G20 comme une caisse de résonance pour fragmenter le monde. On mesurait bien qu'il y avait un risque de perdre un certain nombre de pays qui étaient un peu considérés comme les swing states.
Nous souhaitons la fin de la guerre, nous souhaitons une désescalade, et pour cela, nous demandons d'engager des discussions avec la Russie et l'Ukraine et avec les autres parties.
Saya ingin menyampaikan perang harus segera diakhiri dan krisis pangan, krisis energi, krisis finansial harus segera selesai dan itu bisa terjadi kalau kita bisa berdialog bersama-sama berkolaborasi.
It was my first international summit as Prime Minister. And I think immediately after landing, I ended up having a drink with Prime Minister Trudeau. Justin and I were talking a lot about how we ensure support more broadly in the international community for the Ukrainian cause. I think there was a mischaracterization somehow that the West was responsible for the disruption in food supplies. And part of the job we had to do was talk to everybody and ensure that they understood that the single and primary reason that their food supplies were being disrupted was because of what Russia was doing. You going? You well?
If the war does not end, it will be difficult for the world to move forward.
In a bid to win round skeptical countries, Western leaders had urged Zelensky to show he was serious about peace.
Я хочу представити наше бачення шляху до миру, як його реально досягти, і не тільки для нас, але й для усіх вас, ваших союзників.
Zelensky outlined a 10-point plan, insisting Russia fully withdraw from Ukraine before negotiations start.
Якщо стисло, це про справедливість. Нам нічого зайвого не треба, але ми свого не маємо права віддавати. Як тільки ми почнемо щось своє віддавати, майте на увазі кількість країн, які почне друг з другом з'ясовувати стосунки, буде з кожним днем збільшуватися геометрична прогресія. І тоді весь світ прийде в світ величезного хаосу.
Росія каже, що нібито хоче закінчити цю війну, хай доведе це діями. Очевидно, що
Zelensky intervient assez longuement, avec une très puissante argumentation, et on voit que Lavrov se sent mal à l'aise, demande à prendre la parole.
Lavrov was saying that, look, we are ready to consider any serious proposals about peace, but Zelensky plan, so-called Zelensky 10-point plan, which is nothing but, but an insult to intelligence, because it's a plan for Russia to surrender, and that's not a plan but an ultimatum.
The leaders retired for the night with no agreement. They were due to reconvene in the morning. Then, reports started to come through that a missile had struck Poland.
I was asleep in my bed. So you get that phone call in the middle of the night and you do think the worst. And the worst case was that Russia had just fired a missile into a NATO country.
Initially, we had no idea exactly what had happened beyond the fact that it was a missile strike that had killed Poles. That could have escalated very, very quickly.
My Western counterparts were very much concerned about the possibility of escalation. And I was a little bit surprised, I must say, because I assumed that the primary obligation of NATO was to provide protection for the NATO member states.
How serious a moment is this, Mr. Macron?
Es war eine sehr angespannte Situation. Wir sind auf Bali in einem Urlaubsressort. Die verschiedenen Delegationen sind in sehr unterschiedlichen Hotels. Morgens um 8 waren alle im Hotel des US-Präsidenten, die den besten Raum dafür hatten.
Thanks, Press. Thanks, Press. We appreciate it. Thank you, Press. Thanks, guys.
There was already starting to be some things spreading online which were inflaming the situation. And the key thing we're all trying to do is establish the facts.
Fresh intelligence was beginning to emerge from the crash site. It looked like the strike had been caused by a stray Ukrainian air defense missile. But the Ukrainians were denying it.
Поляки є нашими друзями, поляки є нашими партнерами. Наша ракета не мала ніякого сенсу для того, щоб вона перебувала на території Польщі.
Сьогодні російські ракети ударили по Польщі, по території нашої дружньої країни. Загинули люди.
Western leaders had to decide how to tell Zelensky they were not going to back his version of events.
It was decided that I and the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, would call President Zelensky. It was felt that in the UK and Canada were countries that Ukraine trusted. So I was stuck in a room with Justin trying to get hold of Vladimir. He was, for security reasons, in a bunker, not that easy to track down.
Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Sunak, President Zelensky, please go ahead, you're online.
Hello, Vladimir.
We said to Vladimir that regardless of what's happened here, we as your friends know that ultimately no one would be having to fire any missiles in any capacity whatsoever if it wasn't for the fact that Russia had illegally invaded your country. And then the second thing was just to make sure that he could, get his entire system to remain calm and not to say things until we had established all the facts.
Mais adapté, mais ce que ça a montré, cet incident, c'est la gravité de cette guerre. Une situation telle que celle-là, quand elle se produit, pourrait donner lieu à un moment donné, sans que personne ne le veuille réellement, à une espèce d'escalade.
The stray Ukrainian missile that hit Poland had been fired after Putin launched a huge barrage of rockets on Ukraine's cities.
Сейчас много шума по поводу наших ударов по энергетической инфраструктуре соседней страны. Да, мы делаем это. Но кто начал? Кто ударил по мосту, по Крымскому?
On the front lines, Putin's forces were digging in for a war of attrition. By December, the Ukrainians had nearly exhausted their supply of munitions.
What we were seeing on the ground is this massive armored force
And the Russians have chosen to double down in the Donbass. This becomes a pitched artillery battle. And of course, if you're in the fight, if you're in Ukraine, you want more of everything as fast as you can get it.
Desperate for more support, Zelensky knew he had to do something drastic.
It's actually easy to forget what a big deal it was for him at the time to leave the country. There was the security questions of getting him safely from the capital and within the country out, as well as getting him here and back.
It was very important to fly to United States to show them how we gratitude of their support, because we saw fatigue syndrome of this war.
All the appreciation to you, first of all, Mr. President, for your big support and leadership. Of course, Europe, many countries helped us and are helping now.
They talked about how the war was unfolding. You know, President Zelensky gave his assessment of what was happening on the battlefield and, of course, what its needs would be in terms of additional support and additional weapon systems.
We're going to continue to strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend itself, particularly air defense, and that's why...
Now, prior to this, I'd gone to President Biden and said, you know, I recommend we give the Ukrainians a bit more capability to be able to move further faster. And I asked the president for his support in providing Bradley fighting vehicles and some Stryker vehicles. We talked through that. President Zelensky was encouraged by what he heard.
Maybe I sound naive, but can we make a long story short and give Ukraine all capabilities it needs and liberate all territories rather sooner than later? Thank you.
Well, his answer is yes.
I agree.
Zelensky's next stop was Congress, which was about to vote on a new spending bill that could release billions of dollars for Ukraine. It was the last such vote before the Republicans took control of the House.
I think it's too much.
It's a great honor for me to be at the U.S. Congress and speak to you and all Americans. Against all odds and doom and gloom scenarios, Ukraine didn't fall. We have artillery. Yes. Thank you. We have it. Is it enough? Honestly, not really.
Потрібно бути сильними і вимагати, вимагати, тому що у нас немає іншого шансу вижити.
Thank you.
Так? Ось і все. Бо в кінці кінців гинули тільки ми, а захищаємо ми не тільки нас.
The next day, Congress signed off on $45 billion for Ukraine. But it didn't include what Zelensky really wanted for a new offensive: NATO-grade battle tanks. Western leaders now had to decide how far they were willing to go to back Ukraine.
I spent countless hours actually with the Defense Secretary and the Foreign Secretary kind of huddled in our secret room downstairs to work out the right strategy.
They said there are only two outcomes to this war. Either Russia wins or Ukraine wins. Either quickly or slowly. And my estimation was that if we had a scenario where Ukraine was only winning slowly, that would play into what we knew to be Putin's desired outcome, which is a long, painful, attritional, dragged-out warfare. So the only credible option left was to help Ukrainians win as quickly as possible.
Today, I can announce the most significant package of combat power to date to accelerate Ukrainian success. This includes a squadron of Challenger 2 tanks with armoured recovery and repair vehicles.
The message we sent to the international community was each country is going to have to make its own decision, but we have made ours.
British tanks alone wouldn't be enough to drive Russia out. Zelensky needed the German-made Leopard 2s, which were designed to take on Russian tanks and were stationed across Europe.
I tried to switch on my creative approach, how to persuade partners to give us these tanks. We started with the German side. The main decision from their leadership was not. And at that moment, it was impossible.
Immer wieder die Frage nach Panzern aufkam. Und dann auch immer, wenn ich wieder in der Ukraine war, auch von den Menschen. Ich bin da in den Zug gestiegen und die Schaffnerin sagte, Frau Baerbock, können Sie uns bitte diese Panzer liefern? Weil wir alle nicht zaubern können. Es in Gesellschaften Diskussionen darüber gibt, um Gottes Willen kommt der Krieg eigentlich zu uns. Politiker, die Verantwortung haben, eben auch die Gesellschaft dabei mitzunehmen.
The problem was how to arrange a breakthrough in this stalemate. We were trying to help as much and as soon as possible. The Germans seemed to help in exactly the opposite way, as little and as late as possible.
Under pressure to find a solution, Scholz phoned the American president.
Chancellor Scholz said he was prepared to give the Leopard tanks if the United States provided Abrams tanks.
The Abrams tank is the most sophisticated tank in the world, but has a turbine engine. And so fuel, maintenance, all those things, you have to really think that through. Otherwise, you're just providing a 60-ton paperweight.
I discussed with my American partners, gentlemen, give me only 3 Abrams, 3. I will use it near the United States Embassy in Kyiv to protect your ambassador. Just for that, they smiled.
Question became, could we get the Ukrainians Leopard tanks initially, commit to getting them Abrams tanks over time, once they could be trained and equipped to be able to maintain them and actually use them effectively, and that's the approach we ultimately settled on.
Today, I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine.
Wir werden der Ukraine auch Kampfpanzer zur Verfügung stellen vom Typ Leopard 2. Das ist das Ergebnis intensiver Beratung erneut mit unseren Verbündeten und internationalen Partnern.
More tanks, of course, means more firepower, more protection for the troops, and more opportunities to advance. I mean, like every normal human being, I would say that this would not be an honest attempt to stop hostilities.
Divisions over how and when to end the war were only growing. While the West doubled down, others were pressing harder than ever for negotiations. A year into the war, the Chinese president flew to Moscow to explore his own plan for peace. It called for all countries to abide by the UN Charter and respect territorial integrity.
I think the Chinese saw an opportunity to divert a little bit of pressure on them about, their partnership. Given the butchery of Russian behavior in Ukraine, this was an opportunity for the Chinese leadership to try to get up on the high ground.
尊敬的普京总统，我也称你为我亲爱的朋友。我非常高兴能够应你之约，再一次访问俄罗斯，并且是在我。
President Xi explained in some detail about our peace plan to freeze conflict for the moment, at least. Ceasefire first, negotiate a peace treaty later.
Мы внимательно ознакомились с вашими предложениями по урегулированию острого кризиса на Украине. Знаем, что вы исходите из принципов справедливости и соблюдения основополагающих положений международного права.
The Chinese believe this is the only practical way of ending the current conflict. Putin actually welcomes it because Putin's view is that it's good for Russia too.
A ceasefire would leave Russia in control of the territory it had seized and Ukraine vulnerable to further attack.
The Chinese plan, we said we appreciate the effort and we would be ready to discuss it. But the Ukrainians said the plan doesn't fly. They don't want to discuss anything but the Zelensky plan.
We cannot trade of our lives or our territory instead of just peace. Russia will not stop. They will move forward till they will restore Berlin Wall. That's why we have to stop them here and win this war.
As Xi Jinping left the Kremlin, the no-limits partnership seemed firmly intact.
Это как раз сейчас перемены, которые не было в течение 100 лет. Там, где вместе двигаем эти перемены. Перекиньте, пожалуйста, дорогой друг.
Mr. Xi believe this is a beginning of a kind of sea change of international system, that the Western dominance is reaching an end. We are entering multipolar world. Therefore, the rules of the game should be modified. Don't go back to the Cold War mentality. If you pursue that mentality, there will be no possibility of peace.
Since the invasion, hundreds of thousands have lost their lives. In the last year, Putin's determination to fight until victory has only grown. Some in the West are beginning to tire of the costly conflict. And Zelensky's future could be settled as much by the ballot boxes of his allies as on the battlefields of Ukraine.
I'm not a Putin teller, but I believe that the conflict will end when the goals that were announced initially for the special military operation are achieved.
Putin was not ready for a serious negotiation, not ready for serious compromise. And so much as a recovering diplomat, much as I would like to be persuaded, so I think the truth was it was going to be progress on the battlefield that was going to help shape the possibilities of a more serious negotiation.
I would ask President Zelensky a very simple question. What's your final objective? Defeating Russia on the battlefield? If it is that, I mean, good luck to anybody who wants to defeat a major nuclear power on a battlefield.
We will choose liberty. It's like David and Goliath. Small David used special weaponry against the biggest guy like Goliath and defeated him.
War is evil. Peace is the value we need to fight for. But of course, peace has some requirements. Peace must be just, and peace must be based on international law. I think that is not coming tomorrow, but hope is the thing that never dies.